Okay, great. So welcome back everyone from your coffee break. I hope you had a chance to stretch your legs and grab yourself a cup of coffee. So my name is Egli Gshute, and I'll be chairing the session. So we will now start with the first keynote of the conference, and I would just ask you to maybe mute your microphones during the keynote presentation, and please ask questions using the raise hand function at the end of the talk during our Q&A session. I'm absolutely delighted to introduce our first keynote of the conference, Professor Frances McGinnity. She's Associate Research Professor at the Economic and Social Research Institute and Adjunct Professor of Sociology at Trinity College Dublin. She received her doctorate from Nuffield College, Oxford, and prior to joining the SRI, she worked at the Max Planck Institute for Human Development in Berlin, Germany. At the SRI, Professor McGinnity is a joint coordinator of several research areas, namely social inclusion and equality, and migration, integration, and demography. She's also a senior research advisor for the Irish National Contact Point for European Migration Network. Internationally, Professor McGinnity is a member of several advisory boards. She's a member of the Nuffield Foundation funded research programme called Social Policy and Distributional Outcomes in a Changing Britain. She's a member of the Management Committee of the European Cross Action Group called Immigrants and Ethnic Minorities Survey Data Network, and she's the lead author of the International Panel on Social Progress. Most of her research to date has examined labour market inequality, often from a comparative perspective. She has published widely in areas of work-life balance, childcare, discrimination, and migrant integration. She's co-coordinator of a research programme on human rights and equality funded by the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission. And under this programme, she researches topics such as discrimination, attitudes to migrants, inequality in housing, ethnicity, and nationality in the Irish labour market, as well as unpaid caring work, using a variety of data sources and research methods. Another key research interest of Professor McGinnity's is in mothers' employment, childcare, and work-life balance. She recently co-edited a special issue of the US Quality of Life journal, Social Indicators Research, on work-life balance using the European Social Survey. She has recently published studies on the patterns of childcare and the effects of different forms of care on children's cognitive and socio-emotional outcomes, as well as the impact of childcare costs on maternal employment. As part of this work, she was involved in the EduLife project, which examined the effects of early education and childcare on social inequality across a range of countries. So as you can see, she has published widely on a wide variety of topics, particularly in areas of social inclusion and equality. But I would like to specifically focus on her work on research in migration and discrimination. It's certainly an area that I follow keenly. She is the leading expert in migration research in Ireland and has published widely on migrant integration and ethnic discrimination. Professor McGinnity led the first field experiment on discrimination in recruitment in Ireland and collaborated with EU partners on a North-based project examining early sociocultural integration patterns of migrants. The field experiment in particular, which is probably one of my personal favourites from her work, used a novel way to examine discrimination and address a significant research gap in the Irish context, revealing the extent of ethnic discrimination in the Irish labour market and certainly paved the way for future studies. Currently, Professor McGinnity coordinates the research programme on integration and equality for the Department of Justice and Equality. Research topics within this include the Monitoring Report of Integration, which focuses on the economic, social and cultural integration of migrants into Irish society, data needs for monitoring integration, and the spatial segregation of migrants. The Integration Monitor, which is one of its kind in the Irish context, provides evidence to assess integration outcomes in key policy areas of employment, education, social inclusion, and active citizenship. To date, 7 migration monitors have been published, with the most recent one published in 2020. Her other recent publications in migration studies include a study on the impact of COVID-19 on migrants, including employment effects and their role as key workers, and a study on a list experiment on hidden attitudes towards ethnic minorities, which reveals the gap between what people say in public about their attitudes to minorities and what they say when afforded anonymity. So without further ado, I will hand over to Professor McGinnity and her presentation today on migrant integration and racial discrimination in Ireland.
Thank you very much, Egla. I'd forgotten some of that. That was an exceptionally comprehensive introduction. I'm just going to share my screen now and check that that everybody is seeing that
Yes, that's
Yeah.
great.
Yeah, that's
Okay.
great.
Yeah. So I'll just. Sorry, I need to just minimize. Okay. So yes, as Egla said, good morning. I'm very pleased to be here to give this keynote. I'm a sociologist by training, and as Egla said, I work at the Economic and Social Research Institute, the ESRI. I'm going to speak about some research findings on migrant integration and racial discrimination in Ireland for about 30 minutes. Please do stop me, Egla, if I'm running over.
Will do.
So the Economic and Social Research Institute, as many of you know, provides independent research. It's usually to inform policy making in Ireland on a range of topics from a variety of funders. We don't actually make policy, but many of my colleagues are interested in research evidence for policy. We don't do advocacy either. As Egla said, I work mainly on equality, discrimination and migrant integration, and some of the research I'm going to be talking about today is funded by the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission in a research programme for them, and some is funded by the department responsible for migrant integration in the research programme on integration and equality. The approach I use typically involves comparing the outcomes, experiences for a majority group, however defined, like Irish nationals or white Irish, to immigrants or ethnic minority groups. This is very much the bigger picture, aiming to be nationally representative, but it's not the lived experience. The lived experience was well brought out in a talk in the last session here on from the race and ethnicity group on violence against African women in Ireland. That's not what I do. The research typically uses large national or international surveys. What does that mean? It means we need to use the information on the groups and the questions that are there, the measures that are there. We often need to group them together. Can talk a little bit more about this later. This can be unsatisfactory and it can also be limited. Turning now to what this keynote will do, I'll first briefly discuss measures of minority populations that are relevant for research on migrant integration and discrimination, ethnicity, nationality, country of birth. I know these are different, but they do overlap, and the ways they overlap is important for some of the questions that I'm interested in. I'm also going to briefly consider methods for measuring discrimination and the challenge of measuring discrimination. I'm going to present findings from a number of projects, all with colleagues. I'm a sort of serial collaborator on both the experience of discrimination in the labour market in Ireland and labour market outcomes. And then the idea being to give you a flavour of the kind of research kind of work we do, and key findings. Then I'm going to change tack and present some findings on attitudes to groups using a list experiment that was published last summer. That's the one that Egla mentioned. I'll conclude with some reflections, some limitations of the research approaches and challenges as I see them for research ahead. So how many ethnic minorities live in Ireland? This measure from the census is the main measure of ethnicity in Ireland. It's problematic, though it's the best we've got right now. It's also a problem that it's rarely measured. People self-identify, but they need to put themselves in categories. Specifically these categories here. We need categories to compare groups. As I said, one of the main things I'm interested in is comparing outcomes between groups, but the categories themselves are also problematic. In particular, this D, other, including mixed background. And I know there are some researchers in the audience who are particularly interested in this, and we can certainly go back, we can return to this in this discussion. There are some updates on this measure, on this census measure for 2022. We can talk about those at the end. I suppose one thing it's important to say from this pie chart is that everyone has an ethnicity. It's not just minorities. So looking here, you see, not surprisingly, probably, that most people record white Irish in the census, 0.7% Irish traveller. A large chunk, almost 10% of the population, classify themselves as this other white background. 1.4% Black or Black Irish, 2.2% Asian or Asian Irish, and 1.5% other or mixed ethnicity. Following a few decades of rapid immigration, I'll not show you the immigration slide, but I think everybody would be aware of how Irish society has changed. Ireland has become more diverse, though of course there were long-standing ethnic minorities, in particular Irish travellers. There's also been UK nationals living in Ireland for decades. Immigration of other non-Irish nationals is mainly since the early 1990s. So when people talk about immigrants, they normally measure country of birth. And here, for example, from the 2016 census, we see that 17% of the population of Ireland was born abroad. That's high by European standards. But if you ask people, what is your nationality? It's 12%. There are 12% non-Irish and 88% Irish citizens. And then the overlaps, because I'm really interested in the overlaps, because sometimes I'm interested in migrant integration, and that's the research question. Or sometimes it's ethnicity and ethnic group outcomes and the differences between these. So I'm interested in the overlaps and the links. So using the shorthand COB for country of birth by nationality, we find that 1/3 of EEA, let's call that EU-born, are Irish citizens. Almost half of those living in Ireland in 2016 who were born outside the EU were Irish citizens. So you can be Irish citizens by birth or by acquisition of citizenship. And most of the non-EEA acquired citizenship in Ireland. Looking then at country of birth by ethnicity, say, just as an example, 38% of the Black ethnic group were born in Ireland. 50% of the Black ethnic group are Irish citizens. So, so a number of them have acquired citizenship by naturalization. So now turning now to discrimination and how we measure it. Discrimination, be that racial discrimination or gender discrimination or any, is understood here as less favourable treatment on the basis of who you are, that's your group membership, rather than what you can do, for example, in the labour market. Discrimination is damaging both to the individuals who experience it and also to society, because it means people aren't feeling integrated and belonging in that society, and they're not using their skills for the best advantage of that society. But it's challenging to measure. There've been a number of methods used, and each of these approaches has their kind of strengths and limitations, and each provides different insights. I see these as complementary. In what I'm going to talk about now, I'll focus on mostly labour market discrimination, because that's where I've done most work, and try and give mostly Irish examples that will be familiar to some of you. So One way of measuring discrimination then is to compare group outcomes. You can compare unemployment rates between different ethnic groups. You can look at wages, you can look at job quality, adjust for other potential sources of difference, education, qualifications, experience on the job using statistical models. I've done this and will present some findings on this with colleagues. A report with Dorothy Watson used this approach for Irish travellers, and in another report we used country of birth and ethnicity. This method is good for assessing inequality, the ethnic penalty and disadvantage, but it's not always clear how much of the remaining difference is due to discrimination or other reasons, such as somebody didn't know or they didn't see the job ad, they never applied. We could talk about this a little bit more later. You know, you might say, well, why don't you look at legal cases? That's a very stringent standard of evidence. Successful legal cases are good on the detail, but a problem for me is that they're non-representative. It's a tip of the iceberg. Very few people who've experienced discrimination have the resources to take a case. So if you're relying on numbers of legal cases to get a sense of the extent of discrimination, you're just going to get the tip of the iceberg. You can also use evidence from reporting of racist or discriminatory incidents, and the I reports here also include labour market discrimination, and this too gives a useful sense of what's going on the ground, but many people don't report their experiences, or they don't know they're living in an area, or they just don't know that they can report. Another way you can assess discrimination is using experiments, field experiments, like Egla mentioned, our chair. So these allow a direct test of discrimination by measuring actual responses of employers or landlords to matched fictitious applicants. You know, they combine experimental methods like randomization in real world settings. So you actually send out the job applications from fictitious applicants, and you you record the responses. It's very compelling evidence, but it is limited. There's been two in Ireland so far. One of them, I led the field experiment in discrimination, and the other one, Egla, is going to talk about later this afternoon. So you'll find out a bit more about the method later. But it's with two experiments and one in the labour market, it's patchy to say the least. But also you can't look at you know, promotion or harassment at work. There's a limited number of jobs you can run these tests in. So but again, we can talk a little bit more about this at the end. Another angle to come from is to look at the attitudes of the majority, the attitudinal climate. You can look at that using surveys, big comparative European surveys. That's been done. You can do, there was an excellent ethnographic study by Bernadal in 2014. You can do a survey experiment. I'll present and discuss the list experiment a little later. You can do analysis of social media. I just heard about a content analysis of media and more conventional print media and advertising slogans in the last race and ethnicity session. But one issue here is whether people express their negative sentiment, more on that later. But also, more generally, discrimination, as I understand it, is a behaviour. It's what people do. And it's not always so clearly linked to their attitudes. Finally, you can ask people. You can ask people directly about their experience of discrimination. You can ask them in large social surveys, large population surveys, and you can compare responses from different groups. You can just survey migrant populations, like the 2005 survey of racism and discrimination in Ireland. You can do qualitative research, ask people directly. An example of this is Eben Joseph's work in 2017. And a more recent study of Irish travellers with 15 Irish travellers on their experiences in the labour market. You can actually look at a wide range of situations in public transport, in banks, financial institutions. You can ask about the reactions, consequence of the individual. You can track change over time. So what? So what's the problem? The limitation of this method is that these are subjective reports. Part of their appeal, which is they're giving the individual's voice, also means that the same situation can be interpreted differently. You know, people maybe didn't know they were discriminated against. Recruitment mostly happens behind closed doors. How would they ever find out? Maybe they thought it was their gender or ethnicity, but actually another candidate was better qualified. So this is subjective, but best practice can minimize the bias. So if you're now we'll turn to some findings in case you're wondering, is she ever going to get to any research findings? Going to talk a little bit about a 2018 report, ethnicity and nationality in the Irish labour market, and give some findings about what if you ask people about their experience and then look at what they're actually doing in the labour market. So as I said, experience of discrimination is subjective. These surveys, these big CSO surveys, follow best practice, linked to specific context, time delimited. Respondents are given a definition of the discrimination based on Irish law. So looking at the question, in the past 2 years, have you personally felt discriminated against while looking for work? So the idea is to get people to recall specific incidents. We're not looking here for a general sense of whether people were badly treated. We're looking for, we're trying to get people to recall specific incidents. So now if we compare groups, here you see different ethnic and national groups. So this is people who we use information on both their ethnicity and their nationality. So here, reports of discrimination among white Irish, and then we've got here we've got white UK, and then other white, most most non-Irish are white EU East, EU West, white non-EU, Black non-Irish, Asian non-Irish, and then because of numbers, the numbers problem, the minorities Irish, Black Irish, Asian Irish, and other Irish had to be grouped for this chart, but not in the model. So what is pretty obvious from this chart, it seems to me at least, is that whereby 6% of white Irish report discrimination in recruitment, 20% of Black non-Irish report discrimination in recruitment. If we model this and account for other differences, we find that Black non-Irish are 5 times as likely to experience recruitment discrimination as white Irish. White non-EU and Black Irish are twice as likely to experience discrimination. There's no difference between other groups when we control for some of their characteristics, their education, age, sex, family type, and length of residence in Ireland. So what if we look at the same groups and see they check the employment rate? Note this is the employment rate expressed as the proportion of labour market active. That's people who are either employed or unemployed, who are of working age, and this is so people who are not in the labour market, not seeking work, are not in here. So it doesn't include those on home duties, the long-term sick. So if we look here, we see that employment rates generally, thus calculated, are are generally high in this sample, but they are lower. The employment rate is also lower among Black non-Irish. So these are people in the labour market who would like a job. 70% of them are working compared to 85, 90 of most others. When we model that, when we adjust for education and age, duration living in Ireland, we find that this group, the white EU West, are actually more likely to be employed than white Irish, but Black non-Irish are much less likely to be employed. What about the jobs they do? I'll just quickly turn here to job quality. We use a very simple measure of job quality, which is the proportion with a job, the proportion of people who are employed, obviously, to have a good job or a top job, as we said it here, you need to actually have a job. So it's of those who are employed, the proportion who are in professional managerial position. There's some surprises here. The Black ethnic group, Black non-Irish, is not the lowest here, though bear in mind many of them aren't actually working. It's actually the white EU East. Only 7% of them, they have high employment rates, but only 7% of them are in professional managerial jobs. There's a high proportion here of the overall minorities Irish, but when we distinguish this in the models, which we can do because there's enough people to distinguish the different ethnicities, we do find Black Irish are less likely to be in the top jobs than white Irish, and Asian Irish are twice as likely to be in the top jobs as white Irish. So some of this is to do with the work permit system and conditions for coming into Ireland. I can talk about this a little later too. Then taking a different angle, a different data source, looking at labour market integration and potential other explanations, the role of the protection system, acquiring Irish citizenship, ethnicity, English language skills. In this report from last summer, Origin and Integration, a study of migrants in the 2016 census, we use census microdata. So that means we have all the foreign-born, excuse me, all the migrant groups, 750,000 in the data. So this really is big data. We compare the different migrant groups. So we don't have reasons for migration. So we first distinguish sort of EU free movers, people who can come, you know, migrants who can come to live and work in Ireland without distinction, the non-EU who are subject to what's known as managed migration. I realise this is a simplification. As we don't have reasons for migration, the workaround is based on work by Philip O'Connell at UCD. We calculate a likelihood of entering Ireland as a protection applicant based on estimates of refugees and countries. So we can get a sense of how likely it is that someone has come through the protection system. And then importantly, we also, in our modelling, we also explore the role of age, gender, qualifications, self-rated English, ethnicity, length of residence, and whether or not people are an Irish citizen. Just a few selected findings here in terms of migrants' labour market outcomes. EU-born have a lower unemployment risk, but also poorer jobs than non-EU born when they do have a job. For non-EU nationals, not surprisingly, being an Irish citizen is associated with lower unemployment and higher occupational attainment. As I said at the start, almost half of them are. And this does seem to be associated with better labour market outcomes. Migrants from countries with high rates of protection applications have worse labour market outcomes, especially unemployment risk, than others. And even after we account for all of these other factors like English language skills, education, duration in Ireland, citizenship, and whether they're likely to have come through the protection system, compared with white migrants, Black migrants are more likely to be unemployed, but not Asian migrants. Asian migrants are actually more likely to be in a high-skilled job than white migrants. So this, I guess, part of the appeal of this strategy for me is looking at, when we're looking at migrant outcomes and wanting to know the role of ethnicity, we want to try and isolate as many other factors, like, for example, English language skills, or is it English language skills? No, it's not. Or it certainly is, but this doesn't account for the black-white difference in terms of migrants. Yes, some policy implications. Many of you will know this. These findings do imply that those who have come through the protection system may need extra supports. English language training for adults is important. I haven't stressed that so much here. And also the ethnic group differences and the reported experience that I also measured indicates that policies to monitor and respond to discrimination are an important part of the policy response. Egla, I realise I'm nearly out of time here, but I would like to talk briefly from a very different perspective about the response to immigration and minority groups. This is in the attitudinal climate approach. Sincere thanks to Matt Creighton from UCD. He has done many of these survey experiments. This was my first. This report is called Hidden and Revealed Attitudes and was published last summer. So we know that attitudes are important to gauge a response of the majority population and the climate. But we were concerned, and I have been concerned for many years, that people in Ireland don't reveal their prejudice openly in surveys, for example, the kind of surveys I would normally use. So this experiment was designed to test this for the first time in Ireland. So basically, some people in the survey were asked directly about their attitudes to immigration of different groups, and others were allowed to respond anonymously. How does this work? This is like a randomized control trial in medicine. I suspect everyone is familiar with a randomized control trial in testing vaccines. But the language is the same, except nobody's getting a vaccine or any drugs. They're just getting a bunch of questions. So here in the treatment group, they were asked about how many of these issues that they support. You can see here there's a couple of what's known as filler items. Those are just sort of general things people might have an opinion of. They're selected so that they have sort of certain properties. That's not so important for now. The important thing is that the treatment group get these 3 items and also the target item, which in this case, in the June experiment, was more Black people coming to live in Ireland. So they weren't asked which they supported, just how many of these 4 items they supported. The control group, they got the 3 filler items about higher weekly state pension, lower tax on diesel, bigger fines for litter. How many of those 3 items they support? They also got a direct question: would you support more Black people coming to live in Ireland? In the July experiment, the question was on Muslim people coming to live in Ireland. Note this was added to another ESRI unrelated survey, an economic sentiment monitor. As is often the case with these types of surveys, they're quite often slipped into surveys that aren't specifically on people's attitudes to something like immigration to avoid priming effects. So by comparing the responses of the control group and the treatment group, we can see how many support more Black people coming to Ireland when they're asked directly and when they express their opinions anonymously. So what do we find? On this chart and all remaining chart, well, there's only a few, support for Black immigration is in blue and support for Muslim immigration is in yellow. The bars represent directly expressed support, and then the darker bars in each, directly expressed support and anonymously expressed support from the two list experiments. The difference between the two is the extent of masking or concealing of attitudes. And only significant differences are marked with arrows. I don't mean substantive significance here, but statistical significance. So, so actually 66% of people say they support more Black people coming to Ireland when they're asked directly. But when allowed to express their opinions anonymously, only half of them do. So there's a 15% difference here in what they say when asked directly and what they say which revealed anonymously. For Muslims, this this doesn't happen. There's a slight difference in the directly expressed and anonymously expressed, but actually it's very minor. There's no such concealing resistance to Muslim immigration. But if you were relying on the direct responses, you'd think people in Ireland were more supportive of Black immigration than Muslim immigration. But if you compare the anonymous responses, they're very similar. It's about half. Another surprising finding, I think it's always good to be surprised by research findings. The sample was split for each group into those with lower education. It's not that low, but it's a leaving certificate or less, and high. So these are respondents' education levels. These are the low educated, and here's the high, and these are the low educated in the July sample, and this is the high educated. So what's the story? Among people with third level education, over one quarter, 27% conceal negative attitudes to the Black ethnic group, and over 1/5 of the highly educated conceal negative attitudes, conceal lack of support for Muslims. A much smaller proportion of those with leaving certificate or less conceal negative attitudes. And it's not significant for the Muslim at all. So when you compare what's labeled covert or anonymously expressed attitudes, there's actually very little difference in the attitudes of both groups. Bear in mind, this is only two because of the sample size restrictions. It's just those with a leaving certificate or lower and those with a university degree or more. There's only two categories here. But it's a really big finding in surveys of attitudes to immigrants that people with higher levels of education are more positive. But this report slightly challenges that notion. It may not be that the highly educated are more tolerant. They may be just better at hiding their negative attitudes in public. What are the implications of this research? Directly expressed attitudes to minorities still matter. They're likely to influence public behaviour and the public experience of minority groups and harassment, how welcome they feel. These covert or anonymously expressed attitudes may matter more for private actions, for voting, hiring, letting property. And as we saw earlier, the experience of discrimination in recruitment is high for the Black ethnic group. And decision makers are likely to be highly educated. So directly expressed opinions are important, but efforts may be also needed to understand, to acknowledge and combat more subtle forms of prejudice. So just wrapping up on limitations of this research and lessons for the future. We know we're missing a lot. There's no second generation on many adult surveys. Ethnicity is rarely measured on survey or administrative data. We often can't say anything about Irish travellers because the group is so small, and we have. I appreciate that there's very little discussion of intersectionality. There was quite a lot of discussion in the last session about intersectionality and the different experiences of ethnic minority women, for example. Back to the issue of ethnicity and problems of measuring race and ethnicity in Ireland, I firmly believe that what gets counted counts, and ethnic minorities often don't get counted. Also, that to gather evidence and compare group outcomes, we need to divide people into groups, which is not always easy or correct, particularly for dual identities, for mixed race. COVID and non-Irish nationals, I purposely didn't cover here because my colleague, my ESRI colleague Shannon Enright is going to be talking about that this afternoon. I'll just finally wrap up by a takeaway, if you only remember one thing. Designing and measuring measures to combat discrimination is important, it's urgent, but it's very challenging. But we should keep trying to understand, to go from different angles and question ourselves. Thanks for listening. There's some links if you want to read more, but I get in touch if you have any additional queries. I hope now to be able to address some of these in the Q&A. I've run over a bit. I'll just stop sharing.